Welcome, everybody, to the TrojAI webinar series. Really excited today to talk about the OWASP Top 10 for LLMs. We've got a great panelist here, and we are looking forward to diving right in. So, by way of introduction, I'm Weiner. I'm the CEO of TrojAI, your host today. We are lucky enough to have Jeremiah Salamon on as well. Jeremiah is a distinguished information security leader who currently leads the information security program at one of the largest law firms, with more than a decade of experience in security operations and architecture and engineering, as well as governance, risk, and compliance. Jeremiah excels in guiding a top-tier team dedicated to safeguarding critical information and effectively managing risk. Jeremiah also leads the Boston, Massachusetts chapter of OWASP, further showcasing his commitment to advancing cybersecurity and giving back to the community. Jeremiah, it's awesome to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, Lee, thanks for having me. Really excited to talk to you today.
Good, awesome. So we're going to get right into it, and today we're going to talk about OWASP and the top 10 for LLMs. For those that don't know, OWASP produces a set of top 10s, but we'll talk about that. The top 10 for LLMs recently did change, which is what primarily we will chat about, and then just kind of we'll talk a little bit about the future predictions. So maybe, Jeremiah, if you don't mind giving us a little bit of an overview of who is OWASP and just a little background on the organization, that'd be great.
Yeah, so OWASP is an organization that is started as the Open Web Application Security Project. It is now the Open Worldwide Application Security Project, kind of making it all-encompassing of not just the web application security concerns, but overall application security concerns. It's a community-driven nonprofit foundation. They have chapters like our Boston chapter all over the world, and they also do major projects that are all open source. The OWASP top 10 being the most famous, and I think the top 10 LLMs growing in that fame quite quickly. They've also built out many different projects like the SAM project and other maturity frameworks and things like that that help application security teams kind of develop their application security program and mature application security across the globe, not just in individual organizations, but as a kind of global initiative.
Yeah, I think my experience too with the top 10s has been critical for and really helpful for application security teams of all types and sizes. It's a great framework that many organizations use to benchmark hygiene and risks and threats against. To your point, Jeremiah, back years ago when it started with primarily for web application threats, very impactful, had a huge impact on the industry for sure. One thing I should have mentioned earlier is if you have a question, enter it in the chat, or not in the chat, sorry, in the Q&A in the Zoom webinar. I tend to forget that, so just reminding everyone, if you have a question, go ahead. We'll answer some at the end. So Jeremiah, just on the top 10 for LLMs, maybe your opinion on kind of the reason for the OWASP top 10 for LLMs, kind of why OWASP kind of got into this problem area, if you will.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to describe it as a problem area. Definitely an interesting and kind of sophisticated developing. I like to look at it as similar to cloud adoption, right? So back when cloud organizations and cloud's infrastructure started to become a popular area, there was a lot of security-related concern caused by misconfiguration, misunderstanding of the solutions. I think that drove an urgency to bring up a top 10 or some level of control and understanding around large language models. The cloud adoption was very fast. LLMs and generative AI and other AI solutions has been even faster over the past couple of years. It went from almost a minimal existence to an unavoidable component of all applications. And I think that's really driving the importance of why there needs to be some level of security understanding and some base level of controls to benchmark some sort of maturity or understanding of a large language model security potential problems.
Yeah, no, I think that, yeah, exactly. I think this notion of generative AI has created a new attack surface. And I think what we hear from customers and people that are in the market is that they are all looking for a benchmark to use, and the top 10 for LLMs is definitely one that is heavily used, actually. It is the most widely referenced whenever we're talking to anyone that's trying to understand their potential risk against LLMs. So yeah, and I think it came out about a year ago, the first one, but the update just you know our perspective on the reason for the kind of update is that this is a fast moving space. Jeremiah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think as we kind of talk through some of the reasons why some things moved around on the list, I think it really has been evident that there's just a growing understanding of the key considerations around LLMs, right? It came on quickly. It hadn't really been thought about from a security perspective, especially an impact to enterprises and the large organizations. And as we're learning more, the importance to get that information out is, I think, reason why the project team pushed out a new version so quickly.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, well, let's take a look at the list. So if you look at the left-hand side, we got the previous version that was about a year and a half ago that was released. And you'll see there's 10 items there, and then you'll see the new version. And there's some, just by we'll kind of click through it, but you can see by just comparison, there's some significant changes actually. Let's take a look at kind of how some things moved around. So maybe just Jeremiah, and we see and hear a lot about prompt injection. Prompt injection is still number one. Prompt injection is effectively a manipulation attack that adversaries can use against LLMs. Any thoughts on just kind of why that stayed number one?
Oh, I mean, this is a natural transition right out of the OWASP top 10, right? Injection has been in the normal OWASP top 10 since its existence, right? SQL injection, other type of injection attacks have been a prevalent problem within application security, and I think it's a natural concern for it to be a focus for the LLMs top 10 also, and any sort of assessment of Gen AI security. Injection in general, I think the reason why they stayed at number one is because they're starting to not just look at this as just pure input injection, but now there's injection from other sources. There's direct and indirect injection into generative AI. It's not just the individuals putting things into prompts, but it's the AI solutions are now going out, reaching out to the internet, reaching out to third-party applications and things like that. And that's causing injection issues. And I think that's why this remains at the number one and will continue to be a problem. Manipulation of the output of the AI, the training of the AI, all of those are components of this kind of prompt injection concern. And I think it's a tough one to control, but it's definitely one to be concerned with.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Jeremiah, your point about direct and indirect. So you hear a lot and you see a lot of examples on the internet around direct prompt injection, manipulation attacks that oftentimes, do things like jailbreak the model. But indirect is interesting, right? Because we are starting to see more even use of things like images and files where indirect prompt injection can occur as well. And to your point, as these models reach out to the web and the internet directly, there can be places where that can happen. So I think that's a good point. I mean, the thing that we tend to see here is that people are looking to, when you think about mitigating factors around prompt injection, what we tend to see is people look to try to constrain or manage the behavior of the model. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, any sort of input output validation too, and any sort of constrained language model where you can put an overlay. We currently use a tool ourselves that has a similar model to that, right? There is some level of an overlay to the generative AI to make sure that what's going into it is in some way a sanitized fashion. I think that creates a complexity of its own because then you just find new ways to get around those controls, and there's going to be kind of like our phishing issues that we've been dealing with the last few decades, right? It's a game of whack-a-mole, is the ability to put a constrained model together. There's some complexities there, but I think that's a really important developing space for us to continue to focus on to kind of push some of these weaknesses. Around that, from the indirect perspective too, in the constrained models, I think it's going to become a growing as we start to do more around constraints. If we still have inputs from external pieces, there needs to be constrained indirect inputs also. And I think that's a key focus for us also. Otherwise, I think we'll see a developing area of attacks taking place where people start to figure out how to do more and more with indirect poisoning of prompts if we're only worried about the front end direct prompt injection.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, we sometimes have conversations with people about obviously about analyzing those inputs and outputs, but then there has been, to your point about kind of like constraining the prompt itself, doing some prompt shaping, is a pretty interesting topic. Not a lot happening yet in that space, but pretty interesting topic for sure. All right, well, let's talk about, I think you and I were chatting about this earlier, that sensitive information disclosure made a pretty big jump, right? It was number 6, and now it's number 2. What kind of things do you think contributed to that jump?
Yeah, I think this is, especially for me being in my current day job, this is a major concern, right? Any sort of confidential or other sensitive information disclosure that can happen through the generative AI models, absolutely a primary concern for everyone. And I think that that wasn't as evident until people started to focus on, especially organizations started to focus on things like intellectual property loss through generative AI solutions. This is almost like prompt injection, right? You put data into it, it learns off of that data, and then it repeats that data to somebody else. Well, now you've given away sensitive code data. We saw this in the example of Samsung having code data pop up inside of a large language model. You need to be really careful about how a model uses the data that's put into it, or what data is being put into the model. And I think that became very evident over the initial couple of months of when people started using these tools, and we started to see sensitive information leaked out due to model learning.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because what we tend to see is that uh, it could be intentional or unintentional, right? So it could be the result of prompt injection or some sort of manipulation attack, but in many ways it can be completely unintended. I think to your point, Jeremiah, where understanding where that can happen and trying to manage that, of course, is pretty critical. And when we talk to anybody looking at securing AI, like PII concerns are it's like number 1 or number 2 on people's list.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a growing area of focus on this. The thing that makes these LLM solutions so good is that they do learn off the data you put in them. But when you're using a shared model or you're not using it in some sort of a private instance, you really have to be concerned with the information you're putting into it, because you're teaching the model off of that information. And now you need to be cognitive of the fact that it will be used or could be used by the model to provide a response back to somebody else.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. All right, let's talk about the next one here that also moved and was renamed actually. So supply chain vulnerabilities was number 5, is now number 3, just called supply chain. Um, Interesting to know why the name change is actually somewhat significant. So curious to hear about that a little bit if you have any opinions on that, and then just your thoughts on kind of why it moved up.
Yeah, I mean, this is third party risk, right? This is the kind of something that's been at the core of a lot of security programs for the past couple decades. I think the vulnerability removal piece of it is because it's not just vulnerabilities in the traditional sense of there's a flaw in the code. It's things like prompt injection, sensitive information disclosure that could be there in a product if you're not aware of what your supply chain looks like from an AI perspective. All of a sudden, you're using a solution, it does traditional searching. That solution now layers in generative AI into the back end. You need to be very aware of what's being used there. I think there's another piece of this too, which kind of plays into one of the ones that moved a little lower in the list around the third-party plugins and the supply chain components of those and what they're layering in to provide additional details into the prompt, or provide additional data into the model. So huge concern. You have to understand what your supply chain looks like. You have to understand who and what has access to your data, where your data is going. I think this is really important to focus on, and goes back to kind of the cloud concerns around what I think bit a lot of people with cloud misconfiguration is not understanding it.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because to your point about the kind of world of third-party risk with AI, it's fairly extensive. We kind of see organizations that are building applications for employees, partners, or customers, and they're using, you and I were talking earlier, Jeremiah, they're using a variety of LLMs, whether it's open source models, whether it's models that they're deploying in their own tenant, Azure, AWS or Google as an example. Or the other scenario, right, is that they are interfacing with a third-party system that has AI either built into it or maybe is like a big part of the generative AI. It's a generative AI solution. And I think it's as we talk to risk and governance teams, kind of distilling through that is not trivial. It's fairly. I think typically this was dealt with through a lot of third-party questionnaires for third-party risk, and I think third-party risk teams are really trying to get their arms around it.
Yeah, a big piece that came up for us is zero retention policies, right? So as you think about what AI models, a solution you may be looking at is consuming in the background, has that AI, has that solution, that product that's layering something on top of an AI model gone and worked with that AI model to negotiate out a zero retention policy? Or is that model retaining all of the data that they inject into it and then training off of that data? And that goes kind of back to that sensitive information disclosure. It falls into that supply chain component.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Okay, let's talk about this move from number 8, excessive agency, to it's moved up.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts there?
I mean, we're seeing a huge focus on, this kind of fits into the supply chain piece too, right? Development on top of AI, augmentation or addition or expansion of AI capabilities through third-party components. And this is going to be, I think, a continuing and growing problem that you may put your security controls in correctly for your AI model, but then you're similar to your browser extension, you put in now an extension or add-in or plug-in to your AI model that is now, you have to worry about all the same security risks that plugin is doing, because now you're putting all that same data into that tool also. And there may be another Gen AI model on the back end, another large language model on the back end that's also consuming and retaining that data or training on that data. So I think there's a important focus here on making sure that when you are layering things on, that you understand what you're layering on, how that is being used, and it almost needs to apply all the rest of these things to it when you're looking at it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, then we've got over-reliance was renamed to misinformation, which is which is interesting. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, we've seen some really interesting ones come out of this in the legal industry, where generative AI will just hallucinate things, make things up to give an answer, right? There's a very well-known example that took place in New York where an attorney submitted a brief to a court and it had completely made-up references in it. Really need to be careful about what the information coming out of the model is, because fact-checking is not the model's expertise, right? It's generative, it's creative, it's predictive. It's not doing necessarily fact checking, and I think that there's going to be a large focus on kind of along the sides of the prompt injection constrained language models, but some level of more factual focus for models from a generation perspective to make sure that it is actually delivering something that is proper, and or that it hasn't had some level of prompt injection or other sort of poisoning from either an indirect or direct training that teaches it to tell you something that's not true or not accurate.
Yeah, no, it's interesting perspective on it, because it's not necessarily just hallucinations. Could be like underlying data concerns or manipulation attacks. Yeah, that makes sense. And then we've got these two new items here: system prompt leakage and vector and embedding weaknesses. We definitely hear actually about both of those things. What kind of what makes these things kind of unique challenges from your perspective?
Yeah, these are interesting new additions. I think the prompt leakage is, in my opinion, very close to the sensitive information disclosure component. I think it's an interesting addition. But I think it's an understanding of how data is being used, how data is being handled, where the potential causes of loss might be from a leakage perspective. I mean, this is the data governance fundamentals kind of number 101, right? Vector and embedding weakness is another interesting one. I'd be curious to know who you're hearing about from feedback on this.
Yeah.
Do you have customers worried about this?
Well, so I think what we see is that with RAG architectures and vector databases, there's a reliance on the underlying both the model and the interaction with the vector database. And so I think when people think about the entire behavior of the model, the vector database is becoming like it's part of the architecture. And I think I think now people are realizing the need to make sure that it also is behaving correctly. So that's more what we're seeing as like part of the end-to-end architecture.
Yeah, I think this is where the kind of learning components of all of this is coming in, and some of the importance of why these models are changing and why there's a development here and a need to get this out is we are quickly learning about things that we need to be concerned with. And I think it's great from an OWASP perspective and a project team perspective that the team is collecting that data and they are sharing that. And I think that's a really important reason on why these things need to continue to develop.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting and good indication of, to your point, the agility of OWASP and just the continued kind of changing in the architectures in the space. So I think it makes a lot of sense. All right,
Yeah.
let's look at where things kind of deprioritized. Right, so a couple of areas here. So probably the one that is maybe most dramatic we can maybe hit first is model denial of service. You know, we hear a lot about concerns around model denial of service, and the reason we hear these concerns, I think, you know, is typically twofold. One is obviously performance degradation, and then the other, of course, is that GPUs are very expensive, and so if you're running AI models in your environment, you may have heightened sensitivity. Your management team obviously is concerned about the cost of these things, and that a denial of service attack through Gen AI is effectively, in some ways, it's like prompt injection. It's a manipulation attack to get the model to not stop, you know, returning tokens, et cetera. But it's really declined. What's your thoughts on that? And it's been renamed to unbounded consumption, but.
I think a key piece here is the privatization of instances, right? People aren't consuming the models that are open, right? If you're going to build a business process that's reliant on an architecture for a generative AI solution, you're probably going to privatize that. We had a little bit of a conversation about this earlier, right? The OpenAI instance is running in something like Azure. That's where most organizations are going to go if they're going to start to truly rely on this. And I think it then lowers or reduces the concern around model denial of service, right? Because there will be some level of control around that. We look at like things like constrained language models. They're going to help with things like unbound consumption, right? You're not going to be able to ask it questions that are going to leave it to run forever. Or you're not going to be able to spam the prompt to continue to generate different outputs. And when you privatize that, you reduce that risk even more because no longer is someone else externally as a threat potentially consuming that model. So I think that's a prioritization based on the way that people are using models and the way that they're starting to rely on them from an organization perspective.
Yeah, the other thing about this is that the way that, you know, it's been renamed, and in reading the kind of the description, they did include things like operational costs, which again is definitely a driver we hear about when we talk to enterprises that, to your point, Jeremiah, are kind of in their own tenants and how they're managing that. So that makes sense.
Yeah,
All right,
I can actually see this moving again and reprioritizing. I think there's going to be a realization of going back to the GPU cost piece that it's going to be very expensive to run generative AI at scale once business processes start to truly adapt them. So this is going to be an interesting one to watch.
yeah, you're right. I bet it'll move around a good amount. Yeah, and then we saw a slight movement in data and model poisoning, training data poisoning. I mean, it's pretty minor. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think this just was that sensitive information disclosure and supply chain became such evidence as being extremely important that they just had to move them up in the list. I think that these things are still, I don't know, adequately provisioned, right? I think although we order these, and I've always looked at the OWASP top 10 in this way, things like injection have always been such a big concern because of the prevalence, right? I think all of them still should be looked at with equal level of concern. And the only reason why they typically move around is just because of that prevalence component.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, back to your earlier point, Jeremiah. So sensitive information disclosure took the place of insecure output handling, which moved down, slightly renamed, but pretty similar to number 5.
But we're seeing a lot more issues, going back to kind of some of the examples we've shown around source code release and things like that, where sensitive information is more prevalent of a problem, not necessarily any bigger of a problem than what improper output handling or data and model poisoning might be.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. And then we had two removals, insecure plugin design and model theft. I mean, do you think these things are still, people should still think about them, be concerned about those two?
Yeah, I think insecure plugin design really kind of could be merged with excessive agency. Model
Yeah,
theft is less of a concern unless you are the creator of the model, right? Unless you're building the models themselves, they're less of a concern. I think that kind of puts that focus more on the things that, going back to prevalence, right? What are the main consumers going to be concerned with, or what's the major problems that we're seeing that are more prevalent? I think that's what kind of drives some of that focus.
yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of summarize, right? Prompt injection continues to be number one, and sensitive information disclosure be number two. I think the top two, super interesting that the sensitive information disclosure jumped a good chunk. Makes sense. Oftentimes it actually is tied to prompt injection. So yeah, really interesting movement, and like you said, we'll continue to watch it. So we'll take a few questions here in a second. But what's your take on kind of what do you think's next, Jeremiah? You're part of you lead the Boston chapter. How do you think about, what changes, what's next?
That's a great question. I think, I mean, AI is just going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to grow in its own prevalence. It's going to continue to grow in its maturity and capabilities. I think some of these big ones are going to continue to be major problems for organizations unless they develop their governance model. They really get ahead of what the issues are. I think that the OWASP top 10 list will continue to develop over that. Based on what they're seeing. I think the changes that were made between the 2023-24 version and 2025 really highlight what will continue to be focus areas. Especially, I see the data governance piece as number one, right? The more these models are out there, the more tools that have them, the more concern there's going to be around that sensitive information disclosure. I think people are going to continue to learn how to break these tools. Prompt injection is going to continue to be a risk. It's really going to be interesting to see how, as the technology develops and becomes more capable. We just saw Google release their Willow chip. Now we're going to start to look at how is quantum computing going to impact AI model capabilities, and then how much more of a problem will things like prompt injection be, or sensitive information disclosure be, with the large processing capabilities of these solutions.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, the only thing I would add there, I think, is that again, what we tend to see is that the OWASP top 10 is by far the most referred to framework people are thinking about as they build their AI security programs, which are quite early, right? Most organizations are still in their kind of early stages of building those programs. So it's I think the really good news here is the dynamic nature of it, and the continued updates will be exciting to watch. So we'll take a couple of questions here. We have a few minutes left. One question that came in, Jeremiah, is how can someone contribute to the next version of the OWASP top 10? How does that work?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So there's a core team. I think it's around 19, 20 people, somewhere around there. But then there's over 100 additional contributors. And if you go out on the OWASP top 10 website, you can get a full list of this. I think they're actually the full list of contributors out on the GitHub page. Some subset of that is on the actual website itself. Absolutely reach out to the project team, reach out to the core team, go out to the GitHub page, start making pull requests, start providing revisions, start providing feedback. That's the best way to be a contributor to these type of things. This is, along with every OWASP project, is community driven. They're always willing and interested in taking in inputs from the community.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, this is a fairly detailed question, Jeremiah, so I'm going to see if I can summarize it a bit. So how does OWASP approach the distinction between LLM-specific risks, vulnerabilities, such as prompt injection, versus more traditional cybersecurity concerns that still might affect Gen AI applications, right? So this could be like scanning of model files, right? Like vulnerability scanning of model files. Do you have any any thoughts on how OWASP thinks about these two things differently?
Yeah, I think that they're, and I think the way I think about them too is that it's more of a reframing based on what you're looking at, right? So we're talking things like, I think the injection is a great example here, right? So application security, the OWASP top 10 is morphed and changed and framed injection in different ways over the I don't know what 4 or 5 revisions that have taken place of that. I think that will continue to take place. I think that we need to frame these things in the sense of, yes, we have a very traditional problem. Some sort of a user input is a poisonable path. That is just a prompt injection, right? That is just a reframing of a traditional cybersecurity concern. And I think that that's how kind of everything looks at, right? Sensitive information disclosure to an AI prompt is really no different than sensitive information disclosure to your logging and monitoring solution, and having to wash out things like passwords and PII and PHI from your log retention. So it's just a reframing of what are absolutely very fundamental cybersecurity concerns.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes what we tend to see is the control framework is different, right? And so I think that's where sometimes there can be some confusion. But no, I think that makes sense. I think your point is like, hey, look, this is a framework for understanding where the top risks are for Gen AI, and how you address those risks is going to vary based off of probably the technology, I would say.
Absolutely.
So okay, so one more, and then I know we're a minute or two over here. What can we expect for a cadence of updates and changes, given that this is emerging and evolving? Like, what's your opinion on that? I know it's probably
Great,
unclear, but
great question. So the traditional list typically comes out every 3 years, right? And there's been variances of that based
yeah,
on different factors around. I mean, there was some pandemic impact to things like that, but I really think it's going to depend on as the team sees needs to change these things, right? I don't think it's necessarily going to be a static set time like the 3 year cadence that's kind of been established around the original top 10 list, at least not for the foreseeable future. As we start to understand more, going back to like our vector and embedding weaknesses and things like that coming out, and we understand what we should be concerned with, I think that's going to drive these changes. Or we go back to this prevalence concern as we start to see a prevalence in different areas of new problems. That will drive changes and adjustment. If we feel like something, or the team feels like something that needs to be moved up in the list, that will drive them pushing it forward.
yep. Well, great. Hey, really appreciate it, Jeremiah. This was awesome conversation. Again, like I said, really important framework, really important work that you are all doing at OWASP. I think it's very well appreciated by the industry. So thanks for taking the time with us today and talking to us about the changes. And thanks everybody for joining. And we will see you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Really appreciate you having me today.
Thanks. See you.
Awesome.